Again, just want to express my excitement for being here. I'm particularly excited about getting to meet some people I have not met before. So, also want to take the opportunity as second speaker to thank Joe for making this happen. I know a handful of us we're more talkers than doers. We've been talking about the idea for a few years, but Joe made it happen. So sincerely thank you, Joe. So, okay, so everyone has, or your neighbor has, outline of my talk here. I've titled it Passing on the Faith of Our Fathers and some other quote-unquote recon stuff. So primarily I'm going to be talking about what I call covenantal multi-generational families. I don't have time to tell the longer story of how I got into that, develop a passion for that. But I also want to take the opportunity, as I talked with Joe and others, Joe mentioned about the aspect of being a regional conference of some like-minded Christian Reconstruction people. I wanted just to take the opportunity at the end to share a few of the specific areas other than covenantal multi-generational families that I'm personally passionate about, that I have intentions to explore and develop locally. So just as a way, kind of a networking thing, there's every conceivable thing that us individually can be involved in. So we need to be networking and finding those. Oh, that's the guy that he's into this as well. So I want to share that at the beginning. But first, a couple introductory things. Both for my talk and as I think of this conference or future conferences, audiences, I want to just identify a handful of audiences that I can conceive of that I'll be referencing in my talk. As I maybe switch, like I'm speaking to this audience right now, maybe switch to a different audience, as well as potential future conferences like this. So I say the first would be Christian Reconstruction veterans. All right. I'd say, most of us in this room, I imagine that is in the category of the adults. And for those of us, subjects are going to be probably more on the very specific tactical type things. But there's also, I call novices, I can maybe split in two groups, so the young and the adults. The young are in this group, a lot of, like most of my children, I would consider novices. They're in some form or fashion convinced Christian Reconstructionists, but they probably couldn't even articulate what that all means. So there's a place where we need to minister and address that need as well. Adults who are just, they know enough. Joe talks about maybe this is a really cool family, what are they doing? And next thing, they don't know what this is about. So, and maybe that last category can be split up as the unconvinced, but maybe there's I can split that into the curious unconvinced. They're like, I'm not sure about this, but I'm curious. There's the unconvinced critics, right? So there's a ministry discussion there. And I was also thinking of I'm also anticipating audiences is being recorded. I know we're talking about social media. I'm going to probably post this to my social media. Most of my Christian friends, evangelicals, they don't know even this terminology. So there's Christian what, so that audience they don't even know what it is. So anyway, those audiences we may jump around and I'll identify them as we go along. So the next qualifying introduction that I want to address, this may be for both the young novices or for those who may be listening to this, the curious or the critics. A Christian Reconstruction conference, for a lot of evangelicals, it might be curious. I know like later today we're going to have a talk on, I noticed on the outline, taxation. You'll notice on my outline, one of the things I'm getting into is alternative currencies. Most evangelicals, I'm imagining a lot of people in this room, yet when we start talking about these kind of details, get some sort of comment or phrase of, what does that have to do with the gospel? What does that have to do with the Christian faith? Some form of that. Okay, so I want to briefly address that question. It has everything to do with it. Okay, we as Christian Reconstructionists believe Jesus is not only Savior, He is King and He is reigning now. Here's, a lot of you know this is a famous phrase from Abraham Kuyper. He says, there is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, mine. All right? Jesus Christ speaks to everything in his created world. Christian Reconstructionists follow Christ where he goes. All right? It is certainly possible for that the phrase people talk about majoring on the minors, but that's not what Christian Reconstruction is. We follow Christ wherever he goes. And sometimes that's talking about taxation, social media, it goes everywhere. So the gospel does have a core. And just trying to wrap this up. And again, I'm imagining you guys get this a lot. With the phrase, that's not about, what does that have to do about Jesus, the gospel, etc.? If you guys know what the word a shibboleth is, and I'm going to read, here's a definition of a shibboleth. It says, definition of a shibboleth is a word or saying used by adherents of a party, sect, or belief, and usually regarded by others as empty of real meaning. Now, even my evangelical brothers and sisters, they see this both with a progressive Christian as well as non-Christian, words like love, tolerance, and they say, oh, that's not really love, tolerance. And one thing I want to say is for my evangelical brothers and sisters, when you say, well, that's not about the gospel, about Jesus, we're saying shibboleth. All right, it's empty of real meaning. When Jesus says, this is where I'm going, you do not honor Jesus or the gospel by not following him where he goes. So I just wanted to get that out there as a qualifying introduction for, again, those in the unconvinced category when it comes to Christian Reconstruction. So a lot of other things I could say there, but we're going to move on. Okay, passing on the faith of our fathers. All right, this is in two sections. I have a part A and a part B. What I'm going to be, I have a difficult time trying to, today, thank you, Paul. So I wrote a book on this subject called Families in Covenant Succession, a Manual for Multi-Generational Faithfulness. So I wrote a book, and there's some in the back for $12. That's right. So wrote a whole book a few-ish years ago, a couple years ago. I did a day-long with an evening training seminar on this subject with a handful of families in this room. So my challenge is I have just however many minutes. What do I say when I have a book's worth of stuff? And this is for most people, it's like, what is this? So all I'm able to do in this part A, I have two things. For the veterans in this room that were there, this is a review, which is part of a ministry we need. Is like, even myself, people ask me, well, what is that? And I go, oh my goodness, what is it? I don't know anymore. I got to think about it again. So for us, it'll be review. And for those who have never heard of this, I wouldn't even call it an introduction. It's just an exposure, all right, an opportunity to explore more later. So that's as much as we can do. And then part B, now here's the different kind of audience transition. I'm going to speak to those that were at about half this room, maybe not quite that much, were at that seminar a couple of years ago. Sometimes I get asked questions, what are you thinking about now on this subject as developed? So I'm just going to address some questions that I've been thinking about. And so the rest of you, just for those few minutes, you can just like listen in, but I'm not going to have time to even explain some of the things I'm talking about. So with that, let's move on here. So passing on the faith of our fathers, part A, the big ideas of covenantal multi-generational families. All right, number one, Christian families are multi-generational because they are covenantal. So before we understand that, just as a phrase, that's a good phrase to have in the mind. So you'll get an introduction to that today, but just lock that in there. Christian families are multi-generational because they are covenantal. So what does multi-generational mean? One, and I might have some bullet points here for those who are listening, don't have a visual. I might try to identify the bullet points here. Okay, number one, families inherit spiritual, material, and cultural wealth from their ancestors. And two, secondly, they are to steward that wealth by preserving and improving it in their generation. And finally, three, they are to successfully pass that wealth on to their faithful descendants. So you saw a pattern there. And these are things, again, if I had more time, we could spend a long time unpacking all of that. But you see, inherit from the past, preserving and improving are related but distinct disciplines, okay? And successfully passing that on. Let's go to the next generation. Wash, rinse, repeat. Every generation. Okay. Next, through Christian families, this results in exponential effectiveness for the kingdom of God over generations. So here's probably, if anything, probably the key point, or I'd hope for fathers get a sense of this. This is what is inspiring to me. As serious Christian, when I speak to men in particular, I'm speaking to all of us as well, but it's the charge for us men and fathers to take leadership of this. I know the Holy Spirit of God is in you. And so I know that you have a desire to be effective for God's kingdom. And I know, like, what my experience is, like all of you men, is sometimes like, where is the time and the energy to get all these things done? Now, what if I took that and I said, you have a time and energy problem? What if I just said, I give you 500 years? Would you take it? And what if I said, not only will I give you 500 years, I'll give you 500 laborers? Does that sound like a good deal? Multi-generational families, churches, societies, in a certain sense, and I don't have time to totally explain that, that's what you get. You plant seeds that have exponential growth over time. It should be absolutely inspiring. It's absolutely freeing. You don't just have your own little lifetime to accomplish all the things that God puts in your heart. So if I tell my story, that's why that was the biggest vexation in my life 10 plus whatever years ago. That's why this freed me. I was so burdened with, I was angry with God. Why did you give me all these burdens? And I don't have the capacity. Because you're a father, plant seeds. So, okay, moving on. Covenantal. We got part of understanding. We need to understand the covenant if we're going to before practices in a certain sense, because that's the theology behind it. Okay, covenantal explanation. The following 4 bullet points here are quotes from different authors that have tried to pack the idea of covenant into a compact sentence. So just to help begin to get our understanding here. So the first one, the covenant. Oh, and as we go through these, listen for a common theme or themes. Maybe I'll just quickly ask the audience, what are some theme or themes you heard or saw here? The covenant is a personal structural bond which joins the 3 persons of God in a community of life, and in which man was created to participate. Second quote here. The fundamental image behind each of the applications of the word covenant in the Bible is the use of familial categories, that is family categories, for the younger kids here, family categories for those who are not bound by ties of natural kinship. Thus, by a ceremony or quasi-legal process, people who are not kin, that's a typo, you guys see it says kind, that should be kin. People who are not kin are now bound as tightly as any family relationship. Marriage is the best example of this. A man and woman who are not previously related are now bound closer than any other bond of blood or kinship. Third of the 4th quotes here. A covenant is an enduring agreement which defines a relationship between 2 parties involving a solemn binding obligation specified on the part of at least one of the parties toward the other, made by oath under threat of divine curse and ratified by a visual ritual. And this final one connects the covenant idea with families. The ability to call down and carry out God's judgment and sanctions, His blessings and curses, is what makes an institution covenantal. The only examples given in the Bible that have such authority to invoke God's judgments are the family, church, and state, civil government. All answer to God Himself. They are bound in a legal bond or covenant that is ratified in an oath to Him. Okay, so just quick audience participation. You guys, is there any common themes, ideas, etc. that you guys were hearing in those definitions? Family, good. Covenantal, yep. Succession. Okay. Legal. And of course, this is, I'll be honest, this is one of those speaker questions. I do have my own little thing back in my mind, and that's part, I'll say legal. I'll just transition. For our own review, sometimes like we need a summary. What does covenant mean? What is it? Sometimes we need like our own translation of phrases of getting to the essence just for our own. For me, how I think of it as kind of a phrase is it is a legal, loving relationship. It's a relationship that is legal and loving. Is one way. All right, so you may have seen that. That's one thing. Is all about a relationship, and it has both those aspects. So now I don't have time. That's another discussion. Our culture, we tend to separate those two, right? Legal. I have a contract with over here, or it's a party with an adversity. I need to, in my loving informal relationship over my family over here. And again, this is why the marriage relationship there's a reason why it's not just a best illustration. And I know I'm speaking to a mature room here, but theologically we know the bride of Christ is betrothed to Christ. That's not an analogy, that's real, okay? But that helps, we understand at least some level that the marriage relationship, legal, and again, we're not talking with the state, we're talking before God, but it is legal, and it is the most intimate of relationships. So think covenant, think of that kind of relationship. Okay, so moving on, we're going to talk about what I call the biblical covenant structure. All right, a little preface to these next for a few bullet points. I happened to learn my covenant theology primarily. One of the books that influenced me most was Ray Sutton has a book That You May Prosper. It's not the only. There's a lot of other avenues to understanding the biblical structure. So he has what he calls a 5-point model. One thing I always like to qualify is that I don't even think he suggests that there's actually only 5 points. It's just a way of understanding. I think the covenant has parts, but it's not. I don't think it could be. It's like 3, 5, 6. So this is just one way of understanding it. So anyway, those first component aspect of the biblical covenant structure, not the content, but the structure. God initiates, so sovereignty. God initiates as sovereign the legal loving relationship with his people. Next, hierarchy. Now the word you see, I'm going to read this, representative. There's as you study this, I know some of you men and families know this, there's different words that you might use to label this part. But this part could be as representation. So that helps me understand a little bit better. And I'll probably talk about this later. This also has a historical element. So hierarchy, the second component. God mediates the covenantal relationship through a representative system of institutional delegated authorities in family, church, and state. Third part, ethics. Outlines the laws and standards that God's people are to obey. It does the terms of the covenant. It establishes what covenantal faithfulness looks like. Ratification. Sometimes this is called oath, sanctions, different labels given here. For me, this is my own choice of ratification helps me understand this component the best. Ceremony, so ratification is a ceremony is held in the presence of witnesses where a self-maledictory oath, big fancy term for a curse upon oneself, it is may I die oath, where a self-maledictory oath is taken thereby binding God's people to the terms of the covenant he initiated. So again, the examples, we already talked about the wedding ceremony, baptism, Lord's Supper, a civil magistrate's oath of office are all aspects of ratification. It is the beginning of a covenant or a response to God in beginning a covenant. And the fifth and final piece of this covenant, biblical covenant structure, it can be inheritance or succession. I think Sutton used the term continuity. So this is the mechanism by which the covenant is to be transferred from generation to generation. The stages of that, and we don't have time to talk about this, but the stages of that mechanism are covenant renewal, conquest, and discipleship. All right, so there is a high-level overview of the 5 parts of the biblical covenant structure. The last bullet point in this section ties it in. So now we're like, what is this multi-generational family thing about? Christian families are multi-generational because of this inheritance succession aspect of the covenant. I just want a quick, does that make sense? Based on just what we've gone, does that kind of make sense to people? I'm just going to get it. All right, okay, all right. So you can see that. So I feel God has called me on to be a little specialist on that covenantal aspect piece of covenant families, is that inheritance succession aspect. So would we have more time, or would you read the book? This next bullet point, core disciplines of multi-generational faithfulness. We'd have time to talk about 10 more minutes, thanks, to talk about this. A discipleship plan and practice, a governance plan and practice, and a wealth plan and practice. So I'm just going to leave that as out there for invitation to explore later. So, but those would be the big buckets of of training in. Okay, to part B here. Just, speaking to those families who have read the book or at the training. Just a few things, little updates here. I have their charter versus constitution. You guys remember I talked a lot about a family constitution. In the past few years, I've been more thinking in terms of, as a primary document, thinking in terms of a charter. A couple reasons why. A constitution, as we know, its essence is more narrowly governmental decision-making. We talked about the other documents or things that a family needs to do to be, walking multi-generational disciplines. We see this in our culture, looking at more businesses. These are the things that businesses do, but mission, beliefs, values, etc. I talked about the historical aspect of a covenant. All right, the history of your family is extremely important. So a constitution doesn't capture. So this, for me, the idea of a charter, I think, is a better document, or thinking in terms of drafting some of these family documents. The other aspect of that, to do this quickly, we're in a unique. Most of us when we get sold on this idea, we're really pioneer families. In some sense, because of the nature of all Christian families are covenantal, multi-generational, and whether they know it or not. I personally don't know any Christian families that are consciously, third plus generation, multi-generational, if that makes sense. I have both my great-grandparents have godly parents, and so that has that blessing, but it's not consciously multi-generational. What's unique as the pioneer families is a lot of these governing things are really things that need to be worked out as an extended family. And so there's the dilemma of, for a lot of us fathers with minor children, how much speaking for can we do for them? So I'm leaning more towards things like charters, invitations. I'm having an idea of this, calling something like a patriarch's proposal. Something where this is an invitation for my adult sons when we want to, put together an extended family constitution. Just because we're pioneer families. So that's this is one of those open questions. You get a lot of debates within our circles. So that's there. Distinguishing between multi-generational faithfulness and a clan system. Some of you are aware, a lot of things that I talk about in the book, very easy to twist and pervert into unbiblical forms of family. Okay. Gary North wrote a whole book critiquing this idea of a patriarchal type family system. Bojidar Marinov has a whole article talking about this. So I'm just throwing, that is something I think for our families, that distinction needs to be made clear. I need to understand it more myself. So I'm just throwing it out there as something that I'm needing to explore. Culture creation in relationship to the wider community. This is so that discipleship aspect for families. I'm impressed more and more every year. We tend to think still in that Greco-Roman of education, academics. We need to be thinking more, emphasizing in terms of culture creation. For Christian Reconstruction families and homeschool families, and rightfully so, one of the things was we pulling away from certain communities, even some of our church communities, because there's elements of the world in there that we cannot be corrupted by this. And sometimes we find ourselves in an isolated, or it's just me and my family type scenario. Again, this is an open for debate and discussion. One thing I'm convinced is that is not, in terms of multi-generational culture transmission, it's not sustainable. A nuclear family cannot sustain culture over time. We need community cultural things, which, as a by the way, something like this conference right here is an opportunity to build things with a community that we need. So, throwing that out there. The promise of writing about family discipleship and wealth plan. Again, those who have read the book, I spent, of those three parts, those core disciplines, I introduced the discipleship and wealth plan part, but I did not develop that. Thank you, Dan. So that's going to be like a volume 2, and sometimes I get asked, when are you going to write about that? I do have a gift for researching when I have time and putting things together, but what I would prefer is there's a lot of these things that can be be practiced in a more mature form with an extended family. My oldest is 17. I would prefer to have some life experience with some of these things. I only want to write this second book once in my lifetime. I don't want to do 2 books. So my point is, be patient. In addition to research, I think it'd be a better book if some of these things I'd be practicing with an adult sons and daughters. Okay, not gonna. That is, we're finished with the exposure to covenantal multi-generational families. On your here, I'm not going to talk about these. Maybe I'll just read them. You got to wrap up and transition. These are some areas that I have passion for. That, Lord willing, when I have more time and energy, I'll begin implementing in at least my local community. After my talk, local politics, Dan's going to be talking about the Christian Liberty Party. This is something I definitely want to get into. Higher motivations, we should probably want to do this out of obedience to the gospel, but lower motivations, I'm confessing, and there's a place for lower motivations, all right? This last bullet point, threats, and I don't know where you get, most of us, I think, are maybe in the homeschooling culture, and I think if we're aware, that could be a potential threat at some point. We know vaccination, land and food rights, if we want to do home births. I'm assuming a lot of us have some awareness of those being potentially taken away from us. Okay, and it probably, at least for me, it's more visceral if that becomes threatened. I mean, parents, if you just imagine the scenario, the state says, your kids, you're no longer can have your kids. All right, that's pretty threatening, and we could see it coming down the pipe. So here, practically, for me, local politics. And you guys, some of you know the doctrine of the lesser magistrate, interposition. We want to be able to say, not in my county. And that's where we're going to have a lot more effect than going to Washington, D.C. So anyway, Dan's going to be talking about that in the next hour. The central banking, slavery, the Federal Reserve System. This is something I'm not as educated about, or more passionate, but I think it's one of the major forms of slavery. So very interested in building family banks. Infinite banking concept. You can ask me about that later. I'm using whole life dividend paying insurance policies to build family banks, alternative currencies. And lastly, education. Again, maybe lower motivation, the public school system undermining that, but a lot of times you get the critique, well, what are you doing about all the people who can't? That's not necessary to make the critique, but if you take that away from... So Stacy and I are very motivated about trying to build something where helping homeschool single mothers with homeschooling. So, all right, that's it. Dan, or how are we going to do questions? Yeah, all right.
Thank you very much. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. No, I think we'll keep that
on. Okay.
Yep. Keep that on, and then Korbin will do the microphone again. If we get a question on that side, we just appreciate you repeat it.
Sure.
So the audio goes through your mic.
Okay.
Great. Good topic. Questions do we have?
Stunned silence.
What's your two-sentence definition of that promise of writing about family discipleship and wealth plan? I know you're writing a book eventually, but what's the two-sentence definition of that concept?
Of writing the discipleship and wealth plan?
Yeah.
Boy, see, here's where I'm... How do I respond to that quickly? Or are you trying to get what exactly are you...
What does that mean?
Maybe think of... Okay, I'll think of maybe a couple examples. Maybe and then I don't know if it's in terms of a conceptual thing. Wealth plan as trusts are something that extend multi-generational families. I would recommend that needs to be developed. And as third, fourth generation, it's going to be managing multiple trusts. That's a level of complexity. So I made this point earlier about Christian Reconstructionists can get into details. I mean, that's going to be that next year. I might do an hour on trusts. And be like, well, what is that? It has everything to do with the gospel. It is stewarding the resources of God, and we need to get. I'm just going off on that. That's an example, but now just multiply all the wealth things. One example with the discipleship curriculum that I talk about in the book is the nature of mothers and fathers. Comprehensive. It needs to be comprehensive. So even if we're using a Christian private school, mothers and fathers still need to have a comprehensive plan, which sounds overwhelming, but it needs to be built over time. So I'm not sure if I'm addressing your question, but there's all those pieces of the plan and then practice are in those buckets.
I had a question as well. So maybe this might go in book 2, but I still want to know what you think about it now. What do you think about, you're talking about culture creation and the need for community. What's the extent of the covenantal bond or clan bond of covenanting through marriage and the extent of unity that exists there and that continues from the bringing together of two separate families?
Okay, I'm going to did people over here hear Joe's question? And I go ahead and correct me in my rephrasing of it. But he talked about, Joe, I'm trying to, two families covenant. Can you? I'm sorry. I think I need you to repeat it.
So each family has their own like covenantal, unit, like you're saying, charter.
Culture, yeah.
And then so it's not unheard of for families to say, I really like this family. Daughter, go to this family so that we can be covenantally related to this other family. And the extent of that relationship and then that dynamic for the continuation, perpetuity of the community.
Okay. So generally...
Were you able to hear it better that time?
I thought he was going to repeat it. That's why I said no.
I won't be able to repeat it. But I think that the question you talk about is like, with culture creation and two covenantal-minded families and thinking about marriage, the marriage of our sons and daughters, and basically that kind of question. What do we do about that, or is it?
Yeah, because I think England and France, they make peace through marriage.
Okay.
I mean, yeah.
So maybe I'm not sure. I can't even re-articulate the precise question, but maybe I'll just respond my ideas on that area. And
please.
Yeah. So those of us who think about this relative to our current American system culture recognize that marriage, much more is this aspect of two families coming together, and it is a covenantal action, I'd say. So this is an area that's more questions than answers, but I think groups like this, we need to explore, because our default culture is the American, even in the church. where it's not bringing two families together, right? And it's two young people, and then the kind of, oh, hey. Like a lot of things, I think there's some areas of freedom here. I don't think there's like one way of doing this, but I also think the default American way is at least not the wisest. In our family, we do talk about we're on a mission as a family. There are wiser choices with other families that when we think in terms of covenantal kingdom of God mission things, that is we're bringing two families together. We can do things with the kingdom of God by wisely, thinking about who our sons and daughters are going to marry. Maybe I'll leave. Aiden had a follow-up question.
Well, it's a comment.
Sure.
Thinking about combining like families to create a clan kind of culture, to bring people together to support, because we're separating ourselves a little bit from the evil world. We need that support. Well, I think we would already have that by partaking in the blood of Christ, through a communion meal. Like that kind of community would already provide that kind of culture. We would, like, marriage and those kind of things obviously could support and, joy and, jubilee and those kind of celebrations. But I'm not sure how we would use that same sort of, dare I say, medieval kind of thinking of combining, families together. That's my thought.
Mm-hmm. Joe, did I hit it, or is there something else you want to tease out of there?
Yeah, no, because you mean
go ahead and comment.
I feel like you're talking about a family understanding, like, this is the perpetuation of the faith that we've been given and the particular vision or mission or whatever, and then how do you continue to manage some of the governance aspects, the cultivation of that inheritance that's being perpetuated, right? So it's both spiritual and material as well. Yeah. So as far as managing the material aspects of it, and then so we're trying to cultivate both, right? We don't have the dualistic perspective that says spiritual is better, therefore, it's all ethereal stuff. There's actually also material aspects to it as well, which I think is a little bit more where you're leaning on this, although I think you're balancing both, right? Yeah. As well. So that's what I'm just curious about, is if there is the perpetuity of assets and stewardship, the same thing can be held for between families. So while their family holds their own assets, when the family, they come together, so if you talk about inheritance for daughters and sons, putting those together, and then the governance of such resources is going to come in. There's going to be some more legal aspects. More legal aspects there that we're talking about. So I'm just curious if you have thought about some of those things. So.
Levels of detail can keep on going. It's like a lot of things. Yes, right. In the direction, I'll just, in a general direction, I don't want to make assumptions, but at least in this room, we our default Western cultures are individualistic. And there's errors. We know that, this is a whole other subject of the Trinity, the Triune God. There's collectivism, all right? So we need to have a Trinitarian understanding of everything. But the direction of, for example, right now, the idea of money and family, even in nuclear families, is like, well, this is taboo, you don't do that. While there's errors, I think the direction covenant-minded families need to go is there's a lot more economic transactions building, et cetera, that we're currently not comfortable with. Are there dangers? Absolutely. But like that can be argued for anything, right? So we need to be going in that direction wisely, if that makes sense. And more so then there's the rings thing. Two families coming together are going to have more in common, more assets, and like this. I don't know how much time, Dan, you're managing time and whatnot.
More time.
Just a quick question. Could you remind us of what the HELOC thing is, that concept?
HELOC, and I'm going to blame Dan for that one. I might be totally misrepresenting it. So home equity line of credit. And so, again, a bigger subject than I could even do it quick right now. Because most of us, even the whole life insurance policy, I know some Christians are somewhat aware of this. It's using some tools, like the whole life insurance policy. We think, well, life insurance, you can use it as a bank. And Dan can correct us at later, because I don't understand. There's a way of using HELOCs as a similar type tool for taking some of the banking. He asked about, HELOC on here. What was that all about? Home equity line of credit. taking some of the banking function. We depend. I mean, I don't know if I get even critics. Are we like we're dependent on a current pagan banking system in a lot of ways. So part of it, I like, can we just do nothing? No, we actually can do things. It's long, hard work, but some of these tools, I think, are ways of starting to take banking back into families. And then also, we're talking about community. Again, a nuclear family, an extended family over time could really build something, but you put a lot of these extended families, come on, guys, next generation, let's have our own banks. All right, so home equity line of credit.
One more question.
So kind of a question comment, you mentioned not knowing any families that are 3 generations down. And I think that's kind of near and dear to my heart. But reading the Old Testament, we see that over and over again. They turned to God, they did a generation or 2, and then turned away. And I think that's our biggest challenge in trying to build this multi-generational thing is not losing fact of passing it on and how we do that. So the more that we can hear about that, the better for me.
Yeah. Amen.
I had one more question real quick. Jason, do you have any desire to help shepherd people through the creation of their own family charters?
Yes.
So if somebody said, like, I want help creating a charter, I have no idea what I'm doing.
Yeah. I do. Yeah. So did you guys, maybe that's the last one, Joe asked if I have any desire to help. And it'll help if you read the book to get some of that, what's that all about, if I'm not convinced. But a lot of work, what is our family mission, beliefs, values, governance, all this kind of stuff. When people read, one reaction I get when people read my book, they go, that Constitution thing, I don't have time or energy for that. It's overwhelming to think about it. And this is one, I just nerded out on it for a couple of years. But I could help people because I've walked that, personally, mentally. So help people put something together. So yeah.
Great. All right. Last question for you: what can we do as a group to help you further your mission and what you're doing?
Yeah.
Other than buying your book today.
Sure. First of all, I'm going to draw a blank. I'm just going to go back to, I think, something I've already mentioned earlier. There's nothing something like this. Families, we're together because there's a certain like-mindedness. We can do things. There's only certain things you only do as certain groups and whatnot. So I would encourage, the families here, your networks. I talked about that one category of the unconvinced, but maybe we need to be bringing those to part of. We have a conference like this that gets bigger, and here's the part. We need to be building our community, okay? Because there's a lot of things about what I talk about that one said we just can't do until there's a more mature community. So keep coming to future conferences. I don't know. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
All right. Thank you.
Kind of a good segue. Yeah. Thanks, Jason.